Over the years, we have faced literally thousands of different enemies while attempting to fight our way through countless dungeons and random areas, all in the name of sweet, sweet progression. But not all of those enemies are made equal, as some of them are way more terrifying than others. Now, we aren't just talking here about boss fights that have given you nightmares due to their fiendishly annoying difficulty, or enemies that appear in sections of the games that have tedious amounts of random encounters leading to serious bouts of anxiety. No, for this, we're talking specifically about enemies with terrifying designs that were clearly crafted in such a way as to just unnerve you. If there's a creepy backstory too, well then that's just a big bonus, because we're all about the Halloween right now, and it feels right to just dig up some creeptastic stuff from our beloved Final Fantasy franchise. So, my name's Daryl, and here are 7 terrifying enemies from the Final Fantasy franchise that will haunt your nightmares forever. Starting with the unknown enemies from Final Fantasy VII. In general, the wider narrative of Final Fantasy VII isn't exactly the most friendly and endearing. You've got mass oppression, instances of genocide, and of course the casual experimentation on unborn fetuses by Shinra's researchers as part of the Genova project. This project started as a rather curious proposition, with Shinra attempting to bring back the cie'th, an ancient race who lived on Gaia and had intense knowledge of the planet. It turned out though that they were misled and were instead experimenting on the cells of Genova, an alien who had landed on the planet and had done its best to try and wipe the cie'th out. When they learnt about this, some scientists decided to step away from the project, but others, like Dr. Hollander and Professor Hojo, were actually encouraged further, and Sephiroth was born as part of this. He was the perfect specimen, with chiseled good looks, amazing combat prowess, and a sharp intellect. But many of Hojo's other experiments weren't so lucky. Some of this was evidenced inside the Nibelheim Mako reactor, but much worse abominations could be found in the sunken Galnica. As Shinra were getting more and more desperate in their attempts to try and stop Sephiroth, one of their plans saw them attempt to send engineered monsters to the northern crater in a Galnica. But their plan failed as the airship was shot down by a weapon and sent to the bottom of the sea, making it ripe for investigation once you gain access to the submarine. Once inside, there were a few different enemies that could be found, and it seems rather appropriate that none of them were even given specific names, simply being referred to as Unknown 1, Unknown 2, and Unknown 3, something which was an allusion to Final Fantasy V. To go along with this, they each had their own rather creepy appearances, which isn't too surprising when you consider how deformed Hojo became after injecting himself with Genova cells. In general though, it's just not exactly a nice place to casually walk around, and as random encounters, they can be pretty nasty. But if you do feel like it, then you can get Yuffie's ultimate weapon there, as well as Cid's ultimate limit break. It's also a good place to try and max your stats, as the unknown enemies can be morphed into various types of source. Our second entry is Gerogero from Final Fantasy VIII. Much of the early parts of Final Fantasy VIII were pretty tame on the scare factor, with fights often taking place against monsters like Catachipolars, Bite Bugs, and Festito Callans. Granted, the alvaret at the top of the Dalek communications tower isn't exactly pleasant, but after undertaking a mission to try and kidnap the president of Galbadia, things would take a much darker turn. Everything seemed in a similar vein to what had come before, with Zone, Watson, and Renoa providing some comic relief and acting like a bunch of amateurs. But once their plan was actually in action and they were able to successfully breach the president's train carriage, the whole mission suddenly got a lot more real, as the president started talking rather erratically, revealing himself to be a decoy, and then it attacked them. This in itself was rather creepy, but after taking a few hits, the fake president would morph into Gerogero, an undead monstrosity with a skull for a head and hideously deformed limbs. In fact, its design was so hideous that they actually censored it for the international release of Final Fantasy VIII, with the colour of the organs and blood vessels being changed from red to blue. Definitely not an enemy you would want to meet in a dark alley, which brings us actually nicely onto our next enemy, the Rogue Axemen in Final Fantasy XV. Soldiers from the Niflheim Empire are present all throughout Eos, but one of the more delightful variants is called the Rogue Axemen, and it appears during Chapter 13 of Final Fantasy XV. Upon the game's release, these enemies, and also this chapter, became rather notorious amongst fans and journalists because it wasn't really in keeping with everything that had come before, in almost every single way. Sure, there were parts of the experience that were perhaps a little creepy, such as encountering enemies at night, or running through dark dungeons and having enemies just pop out, but Chapter 13 was something else, as it was more akin to what you'd expect from a survival horror experience. To set the scene, at this stage of the game, almost everything you've built up with Noctis and the wider party is taken away, and you're left with only one weapon that you can use to defend yourself, but it's a weapon you aren't used to using. So all alone, you have to traverse around looking to try and regain everything that you've lost. But to complete the horror aesthetic and atmosphere, the developers chose to introduce jump scares, which is where the Rogue Axemen come in. Now, some of them do roam around the corridors dragging their axes and looking generally rather not nice, and you're best off avoiding them. But others lay defunct on the floor, waiting to grab your legs when you least expect it, which leads to frenzied button mashing as you try your hardest to shake them off. Such was the extreme nature of all of this that the developers actually altered the experience with patch 1.06 of the game, making the weapon you have much more effective against these enemies. Even still, that doesn't make the Rogue Axemen lurching around and grabbing you any less terrifying, and if you add in their creepy bestiary description, which informs you that they ended up this way after having their operating systems infected by demonic miasma, then it just makes the whole thing even worse. Our next terrifying enemy is Exdeath's true form from Final Fantasy V. Following the defeat of Eniwo, humanity tried their best to try and rid the land of corruption. Their solution for this was to seal evil souls within a tree that resided within the Great Forest of Moor. But what they didn't realise was that over time, these souls would become self-aware inside the tree and would merge together to create an evil, sentient being called Exdeath, who was actually then promptly defeated and sealed away by the Warriors of Dawn. Upon his return in the main events of Final Fantasy V, Exdeath appears in his rather civil knight form most of the time, but as you reach the game's climax, you get to see Exdeath in a rather different light, his original demonic tree form. Now, I know what you're thinking, there's nothing inherently scary about trees. But what about trees with creepy tentacle arms and a pulsing brain sticking out of the top of its head and razor-sharp teeth? And when you then throw in the backstory about how the evil Exdeath tree came to even be, it just makes the whole thing really unnerving. Fifth on our list is Anima from Final Fantasy X, who is one of the optional summons that can be acquired as you delve into the game's latter half. Anima does though make an appearance quite early on in the game, appearing in Luca at the behest of Seymour, who is looking to rid the Blitzball arena of the fiends that he himself unleashed onto the populace. And it was at this point that we got to see just how gruesome Anima's design was. Covered in bandages with its limbs strapped down, chains everywhere and giant tusks on display, Anima painted a scary but sad picture. Blood also trickled from its eyes after each attack during that initial appearance alongside Seymour. But that was just half the story, as hidden from display was Anima's dark underbelly, a ravenous beast that would be unleashed when performing Anima's overdrive. And this actually acted as something of a tribute to Ultima Sea's final form, which also featured an upper and lower half. In that instance, the lower half was Ultima Sea's original form. What makes all of this even creepier is the tale of how Anima came to be. Seymour's mother had tried her best to shield him from the vitriol that was received by his being half Guado and half human, but after finding out that she had a terminal illness, Seymour's mother decided to give her life so that Seymour may find acceptance by defeating sin. It would see her give her life to become a faith, but this was all against Seymour's wishes, and he had to watch his mother commit suicide, an action that would leave him all alone in the world, and could have been a contributing factor to his descent into madness. Alright, so our penultimate entry on the list is the Demon Wall, or the Evil Wall, or Demon's Gate, or whatever else you want to call it. It's just a rather nightmarish enemy that first appeared in Final Fantasy IV, but has appeared in various iterations since, and each time its design was taken to the next level. The core element though is that it's a rather large demonic monster trapped inside a wall that ends up chasing you. This in itself is one of the hallmarks of the horror genre, and there are plenty of people who really don't like being chased, and this enemy pushes that particular button to a T, as it's essentially only a matter of time before it defeats you. In its first iteration, the Demon Wall delivered limited physical damage, but if you didn't defeat it before it caught up with you, it would perform its Crush attack, instantly killing the entire party. When it then appeared in Final Fantasy XII as a guardian within the Tomb of Wraith wall, the stakes were raised. Again, its damage output was next to nothing, with more time spent on trying to slow the party down because, again, if it caught up with you, the Demon Wall would inflict an instant KO status. This mechanic was also present for its appearance in Final Fantasy XIV and Final Fantasy XV, where its design became even more sinister looking. And that brings us onto our final enemy, Calcabrina. These adorable dolls first appeared in Final Fantasy IV as a creation of Luca, the dwarven princess of the underworld. She used them to help her in her endeavours as a mechanic, and they proved to be very useful assistants. But there's a very real phobia that people have about small, humanoid looking dolls, and it's something that has been leveraged quite successfully by horror merchants over the years, that they could secretly be evil and have murderous intent. And that's exactly what was exploited by the creators of Final Fantasy IV when they had Golbez possess Calcabrina, turning them into the stuff of nightmares. Initially, Calcabrina would be fought separately with their horrifying eyes, but if they weren't defeated quickly enough, they would merge together to form Calcabrina, an even creepier looking doll. With Final Fantasy XIV, they took things even further on the creepy scale, as Calcabrina returned as part of Heavensward. I think we can all agree from this wonderful visual that this enemy is just really unnerving in isolation, but when it's combined, it's even worse. So that's the 7. But we've also got a ton of special mentions, as going through the archives there are just so many enemies that can be considered creepy. There's the Evil Mask from Final Fantasy IV, and the Chedonuk from Final Fantasy VI, which recently appeared in Final Fantasy XV. Then there's the Yin Yang and Professor Hojo's mutated form in Final Fantasy VII, the Dark Magus Sisters and their chasing in Final Fantasy X, and the cie'ths from Final Fantasy XIII. Creepy enemies are everywhere. But yeah, with that, my list has come to a conclusion. So they were 7 enemies and a few special mentions that are absolutely terrifying in one way or another, at least when compared to some of the other enemies we've squared off against over the years, like these awesome guys. Oh, they're so cute. Are you in agreement, or are there any you feel are way more scary? As always, let us know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Also, if you'd like to join our growing community, why not check out our Discord server? There's a link in the description below. And why not also consider supporting us on Patreon? You get the satisfaction of knowing that you're helping to support us in the creation of these videos, and you will be rewarded by, amongst other things, getting your name put at the end of videos like these guys you're seeing right now. Alright guys, this is Daryl signing out. I'll see you next time for more Final Fantasy videos.